Hi, my name is Emily, and I never thought I'd be telling anyone this story. Honestly, it's the kind of story you keep to yourself, the kind that makes you wonder if anyone would even believe you. But after everything that happened, I realized I couldn't stay silent forever. This is my story, about secrets, betrayal, and the one decision I made that changed everything. It all started after my dad died. He wasn't the easiest man to understand, and he had more secrets than anyone could imagine. When he passed, everyone assumed the grieving process would be straightforward, that we'd go through the motions and move on. But my dad left behind something unusual, something he made me promise never to speak about. A warehouse, locked tight, full of things no one outside of him, or me, was allowed to see. My mom, Linda, tried to keep life moving. She remarried a man named Brad within a year. On the surface, he seemed perfect, successful, charming, confident. But there was something about him that didn't sit right with me. He was the kind of man who wanted control over everything, especially my family. He never understood that some things are meant to be protected, not exploited. Brad's first obsession was the warehouse. He kept asking my mom to sell it, claiming it was worthless junk and a relic of the past. He didn't care that my dad had worked hard all his life, or that this building might contain things that could affect our family forever. I tried to stay calm, tried to nod politely when he called me paranoid or overly dramatic, but inside my heart was pounding. I knew better. I had seen glimpses of what my dad had hidden there, and it wasn't just old furniture and dusty boxes. Growing up, I learned to read my father's silence. He wasn't a man who gave away answers lightly. If he told me to keep a secret, it was because that secret carried weight, dangerous, valuable, or both. I didn't know exactly what was in that warehouse yet, but I had a feeling that if Brad found out, everything my dad had built could be ruined, or worse, used against us. And that thought terrified me. I remember the first night I stayed up thinking about it. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying memories of my dad's stern warning. Emily, never let anyone in that warehouse. Not your mom, not me, not anyone. Promise me. I had promised, but as Brad grew more insistent, I realized promises weren't enough. I had to protect it myself, even if it meant going against my mother's new husband. Brad's charm made him dangerous in his own way. He could make my mom believe almost anything. He was the type of man who thrived on control, who saw secrets as tools to manipulate. And with him, I realized my father's legacy wasn't just in the warehouse, it was in me. I had to be smarter, faster, and braver than he ever expected. That night, as I lay awake, I made a decision. I would keep the warehouse's secrets safe, no matter what. I didn't know how I would do it yet, but I knew one thing. Brad underestimated me because I was just a girl. That would be his biggest mistake. Little did I know that warehouse wasn't just a storage space. It was a doorway into my father's world, a world of secrets, hidden wealth, and dangers that I wasn't yet ready to face. And Brad, he was about to step into it, completely unprepared. From that night on, my life became a careful game of observation, deception, and strategy. Every smile from Brad hid a question, every glance from my mom held a doubt, and every step toward that warehouse felt like stepping into my father's shadow. But I was ready. I had to be. Because some secrets, once uncovered, can change everything and ruin the wrong people in the process. I couldn't stop thinking about the warehouse. Every time Brad mentioned selling it, a knot twisted in my stomach. I knew I couldn't rely on anyone else to protect my father's secrets, not my mom, and certainly not Brad. That night, I made up my mind. I had to see it for myself. I waited until the house was quiet, my mom snoring softly in her room and Brad lost in one of his long, loud phone calls. I slipped on a hoodie, grabbed a flashlight, and quietly crept out into the cool night air. The moon hung low, casting shadows across the driveway as I approached the warehouse. My heart pounded, a mix of fear and excitement racing through me. The building looked even bigger than I remembered. Dust hung in the air, thick and musty, and the faint smell of old wood and oil greeted me as I pushed open the heavy metal door. The sound of it creaking echoed through the empty space. I froze for a moment, listening. Nothing, just silence, except for the faint hum of the old machinery my dad had once used. I wandered past rows of locked crates and boxes stacked to the ceiling, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Then I saw it, a wall that didn't look quite right. My dad had always been clever, and I could tell instinctively that it was more than just a wall. I pressed against it, and a small section gave way. Behind it was a narrow doorway leading to a hidden room. The door opened with a groan, and I stepped inside cautiously. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't believe my eyes. The room was filled with ledgers, old papers, and stacks of boxes labeled with cryptic codes I didn't understand. There were also cabinets filled with small, intricately carved collectibles, vintage coins, and jewelry that looked priceless. But what really made my stomach twist was the folders of documents, legal papers, bank records, and notes in my dad's precise handwriting. Some of it hinted at deals and investments I couldn't fully comprehend, but it was clear. My father had built something extraordinary, and he had hidden it all here. I ran my fingers over one of the ledgers, trying to make sense of it. Some entries were in numbers I didn't understand. Others were names and dates I recognized from my childhood. I realized how much effort my dad had put into protecting the family, even without telling us. Every lock, every hidden room, every layer of secrecy, it was all part of his plan to safeguard something powerful. A sudden noise made me jump. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I thought someone was there with me, but it was just the wind or maybe the building settling. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. The adrenaline coursing through my veins was intense, but it made me feel alive. I knew that whatever I found tonight would change everything. I carefully closed the secret doorway and made my way back to the main warehouse floor. I paused for a moment, taking in the enormity of it all. Brad had no idea. None. He had been so sure he could manipulate my mom into selling it, so confident he could get his hands on whatever lay inside. But he had underestimated me and my father. From that night on, I knew there was no turning back. The warehouse wasn't just a place filled with objects. It was a map of my father's life, a puzzle, a legacy that I was now responsible for. Every decision I made would have consequences, and Brad's greed would make him dangerous if he ever discovered what I knew. As I walked back to the house under the moonlight, I felt a strange mix of fear and empowerment. I was alone in this, but I also realized that I had a plan forming, a way to protect my father's secrets, and maybe even turn the tables on Brad if he got too greedy. I didn't tell anyone what I saw that night, not my mom, not my friends. Only I knew the truth. And deep down, I knew Brad's time was coming, the night he realized just how much he had underestimated a teenage girl who had learned to keep her father's secrets at all costs. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling once again. I had a glimpse of what lay ahead, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. But one thing was certain. I would protect that warehouse, my father's legacy, and my family, no matter what it took. After that night, nothing was the same. I kept the warehouse's secrets buried in my mind like a fire that could flare up at any moment. Every time Brad mentioned it, asking why I was so protective or acting suspicious, I smiled, nodded, and said, "I just don't want to risk anything, that's all." Inside, though, my blood boiled. I knew he wasn't asking because he cared, he was plotting. He was greedy, arrogant, and dangerous. And worst of all, he thought I was naive. Brad's obsession with the warehouse became almost comical at first. He'd pace the living room, muttering about wasting money on old junk or suggesting my mom put it up for auction. But there was something in his eyes, sharp, calculating, that made me realize he wasn't joking. He was scheming. He wanted control, and I was standing in his way. I started noticing things around the house that I hadn't before. Strange cars parked across the street. A shadow moving behind the curtains when I walked past the windows. Even small things like misplaced mail or extra phone calls my mom hadn't told me about. I began to understand that Brad was taking measures to find out what I knew, and he wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. One afternoon, I caught him leafing through old boxes in the garage, pretending he was looking for tools. My heart raced. That garage was nothing compared to the warehouse, but it showed me his determination. He didn't see me there, hiding behind a stack of crates, watching him, waiting. I wanted to shout, "You'll never get it!" But instead, I stayed silent. I knew the stakes were higher than any argument I could make. Brad wasn't just greedy, he was clever. He started asking questions about my dad, about my childhood, about small details I hadn't even noticed were odd. "Why didn't your dad ever talk about the warehouse?" he asked once, smiling like he was trying to charm the answer out of me. I simply said, "Some things are private. You wouldn't understand." That answer annoyed him, and I could see the gears turning in his mind. At school, I began noticing how much tension this was causing in my life. I couldn't confide in friends. They wouldn't understand, and even if they did, they couldn't protect the warehouse. I was alone in this, carrying a secret that weighed heavily on my chest. And every time I came home and saw Brad smiling at my mom, pretending everything was normal, I felt my anger simmer. One night, I overheard Brad on the phone, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught snippets. "Yes, get it tonight, make sure no one sees, she can't know." My blood ran cold. Someone was planning to break into the warehouse, and Brad was at the center of it. I realized then that this wasn't just about money. It was about control, power, and greed, and Brad would do whatever it took to get it. From that moment on, I knew I had to be more careful than ever. I couldn't just hide. I had to outsmart him. I started creating small traps, keeping logs, and memorizing the layout of the warehouse. I even moved a few of the more valuable items to places Brad would never think to look, leaving only decoys in plain sight. Every day became a game of patience. I had to pretend to be compliant, sometimes even weak, while secretly planning my next moves. I watched Brad, studying his habits, learning his arrogance, and realizing just how careless he was. He thought he was in control, but he had no idea that the real power was in my hands and that every step he took could be turned against him. By now, I understood one very important truth. Brad had underestimated me because I was a girl, because I seemed quiet and polite, and because he assumed secrecy was weakness. But secrets are power, and I had my father's guidance in the form of his careful planning. And I was ready. I wasn't just protecting a warehouse, I was protecting a legacy. And I would do it no matter what it took. By now, I had accepted one harsh truth. Brad wasn't just curious, he was dangerous. His obsession with the warehouse had turned into a full-blown hunt, and that meant I could no longer treat this as a game of patience or clever tricks. I had to take it seriously. I had to be smart. It all came to a head one cold evening. I had been at home, pretending to work on homework while keeping an eye on the driveway through the blinds. My stomach sank when I noticed a dark van pull up near the warehouse, the windows tinted so I couldn't see inside. My pulse quickened. I didn't need to guess who was behind it. It was Brad, or at least someone working for him. I grabbed my flashlight and crept outside, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. The van doors opened, and two men stepped out, carrying what looked like crowbars and other tools. My mind raced. These weren't casual visitors. This was a break-in attempt. I stayed in the shadows, watching as they fumbled with the locks and began forcing open one of the outer doors. My hands shook, but I reminded myself to stay calm. My dad had prepared for this. He wasn't reckless, and neither could I afford to be. I had memorized every corner of the warehouse, every hidden latch, and every trap he had set up. Tonight, I would test my knowledge. As the intruders struggled with the first lock, I quietly slipped inside through a side door I knew they wouldn't notice. The warehouse smelled of dust and metal, but tonight it carried a tension I could almost taste. I moved quickly but carefully, pulling levers and triggering alarms that my dad had installed years ago. Sirens wailed softly, not enough to alert the neighbors immediately, but enough to scare the intruders. One of the men cursed loudly, fumbling with the lock again. I could see the fear in their movements now. They weren't expecting resistance, and they certainly weren't expecting me. I stayed hidden, letting them panic, and then quietly signaled toward the hidden room. I knew that if they found it, the whole secret would be exposed. That couldn't happen. Not tonight. Suddenly, the men started arguing. One of them said something about going back to Brad if we can't get in tonight. Relief and dread hit me at the same time. Brad was the mastermind behind this, I realized, and his arrogance had put everyone at risk. He thought he could manipulate and control things from afar, but he didn't understand the consequences of his recklessness. I stayed hidden until the intruders finally gave up, frustrated, and left as quietly as they had come. Only when the van disappeared into the distance did I allow myself to breathe. My heart pounded, adrenaline still surging, but I felt a strange satisfaction. I had won tonight, for now. But I also knew this was only the beginning. Brad wouldn't stop. He would come back, stronger, smarter, and more desperate. And if he discovered the warehouse himself, I shuddered at the thought. It was no longer just about protecting objects or money. It was about protecting my family, my mom, and the legacy my father had built. That night, I stayed awake for hours, packing my room, thinking about what had just happened. I realized I needed a plan, not just for tonight, but for every night moving forward. I started making mental notes: how to reinforce the warehouse, how to mislead Brad, and how to make sure no one could ever discover the hidden room. I also realized something else. I couldn't let fear control me. Brad's greed and recklessness were dangerous, yes, but they were also predictable. And in predictability, there is power. I had survived tonight because I had stayed calm, observed carefully, and used my knowledge to my advantage. Next time, I needed to be even smarter. As I lay in bed that night, the adrenaline finally fatting, I made a silent promise to my dad. I would protect his secrets, his legacy, and our family, no matter the cost. Brad had made a grave mistake. He thought he could bully his way into something he had no right to. But I had learned the hard way that patience, observation, and cleverness could turn the tables, and one day he would realize just how dangerous underestimating me really was. And when that day came, he wouldn't just lose the warehouse. He would lose everything. After the break-in, I knew I couldn't just wait for Brad to make mistakes. I had to guide him into them. That's when my father's lessons became clear to me. He had always believed that patience and observation were stronger than force, and now I understood why. Brad was reckless, arrogant, and greedy. And arrogance, I realized, was predictable. I could use that against him. Over the next few days, I began my careful maneuvers. I planted subtle clues around the warehouse, false hints of valuables in certain crates, fake maps tucked into old files, and notes left where Brad could accidentally discover them. I watched as he tripped over the traps I had prepared, not knowing that I was 2 steps ahead. He had no idea that the real treasures were well hidden and legally protected, ready to expose him if he tried to claim them. One evening, I overheard him talking to my mom in the kitchen. His voice was low but sharp. "Emily is hiding something. I can feel it. That warehouse, there's more than she's letting on. I need to find out what it is before it's too late." My heart raced. I didn't want my mom to worry, so I stayed silent, pretending to be busy in my room. But inside, I smiled. He had just admitted what I had already known. He underestimated me. I also began documenting everything. Every time he pried, every suspicious phone call, every attempt to manipulate my mom, I wrote it down, creating a record that could legally and safely protect me and the warehouse. I started noticing patterns: the way he scheduled visits, the people he involved, the subtle lies he told to cover his tracks. Each piece of information was a tool I could use to my advantage. One night, I decided it was time to test the plan. Brad had left the house for a late meeting, and I used the opportunity to rearrange some of the crates, moving a few less valuable items into obvious spots. I left the more sensitive boxes hidden behind layers of decoy locks. When I returned the next day, I found that Brad had already investigated, rummaging through the crates I had strategically left unguarded. His frustration was evident. He muttered under his breath, "She's smarter than I thought, but I'll get her." That night, I realized something important. Brad's arrogance was his weakness. He believed he could outsmart me, but he didn't realize that I wasn't just guarding objects. I was guarding information, patterns, and strategy. He had no idea how carefully I had observed him, how I had learned his habits, and how I could manipulate the situation to my advantage. I also started practicing my own calmness under pressure. Each encounter with him became a lesson in control. I learned to respond with measured words, to smile when he tried to intimidate me, and to appear compliant while silently plotting the next move. Every slip he made, every overreach, became ammunition I could use when the time came. But the real thrill came from knowing that I wasn't alone in this fight. My father's foresight, the security measures he had installed, and the careful documentation I maintained were all part of a larger plan, one that Brad could not see, and one he could not stop. He had walked into a trap without even realizing it, and the more he tried to push, the tighter the trap became. By the end of that week, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. I wasn't just defending the warehouse anymore, I was winning. Each day, Brad's impatience grew, and each day I became more confident in my strategy. I had learned the most important lesson. True power comes from knowledge, observation, and patience. Violence and threats could never match that. And as I lay in bed that night, I smiled quietly to myself. Brad thought he was in control. He thought he could bend the situation to his will. But he had forgotten one very important thing. Underestimating me was the biggest mistake of his life. One day, he would realize it. And when he did, it would be too late. By now, I knew I was walking a dangerous tightrope. Brad's obsession with the warehouse had grown into something darker. He was no longer just curious or greedy. He was manipulative, relentless, and willing to risk everything to get what he wanted. And yet my mom, Linda, remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. I couldn't let her know, not yet. Brad's temper and cunning made it too risky. It was heartbreaking in its own way. Mom had always been kind-hearted and trusting, and she believed in the good in people. I wanted to warn her, to tell her everything about the warehouse, the treasures inside, and Brad's dangerous obsession. But I couldn't. I had to protect her by keeping her in the dark, even if it meant she thought I was being difficult or paranoid. Every day, I became more careful in my interactions. I smiled politely when Brad leaned over me at dinner, pretending to help me with homework while probing for information. I nodded when he tried to coerce my mom into selling the warehouse. I laughed at his jokes when he made sly comments about how weird my attachment to the building was. Inside, I was silently planning my next move. Every word I said, every expression I wore was part of my strategy. One evening, Brad tried a new tactic. He cornered Mom in the kitchen while I was in my room pretending to study. "She's hiding something," he said, voice low and urgent. "I know it, I can feel it. That warehouse, she's protecting it for a reason. And it's time someone told her the truth." My mom looked confused, worried. She asked him what he meant, but he waved it off, claiming I was just a teenager with secrets. I realized he was testing boundaries, trying to make my mom doubt me. That was dangerous. Brad was clever, but he didn't know I had already anticipated his moves. I decided to turn his own tactics against him. Later that night, I left subtle hints for my mom, little clues that something was off without revealing specifics. A misplaced ledger, a note with vague instructions, enough for her to sense caution but not enough to give away the warehouse. Meanwhile, Brad was growing impatient. His overconfidence was becoming his biggest weakness. I noticed him packing near the warehouse on multiple nights, making small mistakes as he tried to snoop. He forgot to hide fingerprints on locks, tripped over crates I had intentionally left in easy-to-access areas, and even argued with his hired help about how the warehouse could be breached. Every slip was a window into his arrogance, and I filed each one away mentally for later use. I also began practicing defensive measures in case things escalated. I memorized every exit route, every hidden latch, every secret lever in the warehouse. I reinforced weak points and carefully repositioned the most valuable items in spots Brad would never think to check. It was exhausting work, both physically and mentally, but necessary. I wasn't just protecting objects. I was protecting my family's legacy, and my mother's safety depended on it. Despite the tension, I learned to enjoy the subtle thrill of outsmarting Brad. Every time he stumbled into one of my traps, I felt a surge of satisfaction. Not cruelty, but justice, the kind my father had intended when he left me this responsibility. Brad had underestimated me completely, assuming that my youth and gender meant weakness. But he hadn't realized that I had inherited my father's cunning, his patience, and his ability to plan several steps ahead. One night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what I had learned. Brad would never stop unless he was forced to. He would escalate, he would manipulate, he would try to turn my mom against me. But I was ready. I would stay calm, stay patient, and wait for the perfect moment to reveal the truth in my own way, when it would ensure justice and safety for everyone I cared about. Brad may have thought he was in control, but in reality, he was walking into a trap of his own arrogance. And I had all the pieces I needed to make sure he never realized it, until it was far too late. The tension had been building for months, and I knew it was finally time. Brad had pushed too far, underestimated me too many times, and I had gathered everything I needed to bring his schemes to light. But I had to do it carefully. One wrong move, and not only the warehouse, but my mom and I could be in danger. I spent that morning going over every detail again, checking my notes, reviewing the security footage I had secretly recorded, and ensuring that all the evidence of Brad's manipulations was secure. Every bribe, every attempted break-in, every lie he had spun about me, and the warehouse was documented. I had compiled months of proof showing exactly how far he had gone to get what wasn't his. When Brad arrived that afternoon, acting casual as ever, I kept my composure. I smiled, nodded, and chatted politely, all while silently watching his every movement. He was as arrogant as ever, convinced that he was in control. He didn't see the pile of evidence I had quietly organized in my room, nor did he know that law enforcement would soon be involved. I waited for the perfect moment. When he tried to intimidate my mom again, suggesting she sell the warehouse quickly before it lost all its value, I excused myself and called the local authorities. I explained everything, from the threats to the trespassing, including the recordings and documentation I had gathered. They promised to investigate discreetly and assured me that Brad would have no chance to manipulate the situation further. While waiting for the authorities to arrive, I decided it was time to confront Brad, carefully. I led him to the warehouse under the pretense of showing him something minor. While inside, every trap and alarm I had prepared remained active. I let him think he was discovering secrets, following the false leads I had strategically placed. He didn't realize that every step he took was being monitored, recorded, and documented. Brad's arrogance was astounding. He bragged aloud about his cleverness, mocking me silently in my head. "She thinks she can outsmart me," he muttered. I smiled internally. Little did he know, the true cleverness lay in the fact that he had just walked straight into my carefully laid plan. Within an hour, the authorities arrived quietly, surrounding the warehouse. Brad's confident expression faltered as they approached, handcuffs at the ready. He tried to argue, to charm, to manipulate, but it was too late. Every illegal move, every dishonest attempt had been recorded, logged, and verified. There was no escaping the truth. The look on his face as he realized he had been outsmarted was priceless. Arrogance turned to shock, shock turned to disbelief, and disbelief turned to defeat. He had underestimated me at every turn. He had thought he could control my mother, me, and the warehouse, but his greed and recklessness had made him blind to reality. Once Brad was taken away by the authorities, I finally turned to my mom. Her eyes were wide with shock and a little fear. I led her into the warehouse, showing her the hidden room, the ledgers, and the boxes my father had protected for decades. I explained everything carefully, leaving out no detail about the threats, the break-ins, and Brad's manipulations. Mom's reaction was a mix of tears, disbelief, and relief. She couldn't believe the man she had married had been so deceitful and dangerous. But she was grateful, grateful that I had protected her, her family, and my father's legacy. For the first time, she truly understood why my father had made me promise to keep the warehouse a secret. Standing there in the dim light of the warehouse, I realized how much I had grown. I had faced fear, danger, and manipulation head-on, and I had succeeded without losing my integrity or my family. Brad had thought he could outsmart me, but in reality, it was patience, intelligence, and careful planning that had won the day. That night, as my mom and I locked the doors and ensured the warehouse was secure, I felt a deep sense of closure. Brad's chapter in our lives was over, and justice had been served, not through anger, not through violence, but through strategy and restraint. My father's legacy was safe, and my family could finally breathe. For the first time in months, I slept peacefully, knowing that sometimes the greatest victories come from silence, observation, and patience, and that those who underestimate others often pay the heaviest price. The day after Brad was taken away, our house felt different. Quiet, calm, safe. It was almost surreal. I had spent months planning, observing, and protecting, and now the danger had finally passed. My mother, still shaken from the revelation, kept glancing toward the warehouse, a mixture of awe and gratitude in her eyes. All of this was your father," she whispered one morning, her voice trembling. I nodded. "Yes, Mom, every bit, and I've been keeping it safe just like he wanted." She hugged me tightly, and for the first time in years, I felt truly understood. I realized that all the secrecy, all the tension had a purpose. My father had trusted me, and I had honored that trust. The warehouse itself became my sanctuary. Every crate, ledger, and hidden box told a story of my father's life. His intelligence, his foresight, and his determination to protect our family no matter what. Some items were priceless collectibles, others were financial records, and some were simply memories of my childhood. But together, they represented a legacy, a life built with care, love, and foresight. I knew I had a choice. I could sell some of the treasures to secure financial stability, or I could keep them as reminders of my father's life and the lessons he had left behind. I chose both. I sold what could help my family without harming the integrity of the warehouse, and I preserved the rest as a testament to my father's careful planning. Brad, meanwhile, had learned the ultimate lesson too late. His arrogance and greed had been his undoing. He thought he could manipulate everyone, twist every situation to his advantage, and take what wasn't his. But he underestimated a girl who had grown up learning to protect, observe, and plan. He had walked straight into a web he couldn't escape, and the consequences were devastating for him. Justice had been served, not through revenge fueled by anger, but through intelligence, patience, and courage. Living through this had changed me. I had faced fear, danger, and deception head-on, and I had emerged stronger. I realized that true strength isn't measured by physical power or dominance. It's measured by patience, foresight, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when no one else can see the danger. My mother and I began to rebuild our lives. She finally understood why my father had been so secretive and why I had kept his trust. We worked together to ensure the warehouse remained protected, reinforcing locks, updating security, and documenting everything meticulously. It became more than just a building. It was a symbol of resilience, strategy, and family loyalty. Occasionally, I would think about Brad. The look of shock on his face the day the authorities arrived was burned into my memory. It served as a reminder that greed and arrogance can never triumph over intelligence and patience. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall. It was simply a lesson in reality. People who underestimate others often pay the heaviest price, and Brad's arrogance had ensured he would. As for me, I finally felt free. Free to honor my father's memory, free to protect my family, and free to live without fear of manipulation or danger. I had learned that keeping secrets isn't always about hiding the truth. It's about protecting what matters most until the right moment arrives. Sometimes I still walk through the warehouse alone at night, flashlight in hand, memories of my father's wisdom guiding me. I smile quietly to myself, knowing that I succeeded not because I was stronger than Brad, but because I was smarter, more patient, and courageous enough to act when it mattered most. And in that quiet reflection, I understand the truth. Revenge isn't about anger or violence. It's about strategy, justice, and timing. Brad may have thought he was in control, but in reality, he was simply a lesson in what happens when arrogance meets someone who refuses to be underestimated. The warehouse stands as it always has, a legacy preserved, secrets safe, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest power lies not in force, but in the quiet strength of intelligence, patience, and unwavering courage. And I will always protect it for my father, for my family, and for myself.